Vamos a tener la siguiente intervención.
The next panelist will be Professor Cristina Gutiérrez Cortines, Professor of History of Art in the University of Murcia. She has asked me to reduce the introduction in order to gain some time, but I have to say something about her and about her professional itinerary. She's an expert in history of architecture and urban planning, preservation and sustainability of inner historical areas, and in urban management. She has been throughout her life in different representation bodies where she knows very well the management of heritage. She's president of Ars Civilis, and she has been European Parliament member. She has written about Europe. Oh, she's going to speak about Europe, an open and an open civilization.
Thank you very much. It's an honor, a real honor to be here because I admire the Yuste Foundation, how they work, how they started ambitious programs like the Route of Charles V and the criteria for excellence and self-quality that they're implementing. So I admire their trajectory. They're uniting and bringing together many people and many variables that were not included in the usual European politics. So I would like to congratulate them. I'd like to say that my presentation is not based on any official speech. It is a result of being angry, and I am studying, and I'm not satisfied with the official version, so I tried to do something different. I was part of the European Parliament from 1999 to 2014, and back then we thought that cultural policy could not be subsidiary. Europe was not dealing with culture as a whole. They dealt with monasteries, creativity, then the next year it dealt with the Holocaust and so on. But there was not a mainstream cultural policy, and it's not including the Maastricht Treaty. And that created a false speech, for me at least, where they said that the European culture is diverse. What is diversity? Imagine that aliens come to the Earth and they say, what is culture? What is that? We're trying to escape from the problem, to run on the other direction. So I'm really fed up, and I say that, really fed up. Every time that we try to introduce different type of politics, I'm outraged because they rejected them, because some states and some countries like the UK, France and Germany, they do not want to have a European common policy, and that deform the speech. We have fought for many years to have the heritage within the Parliament. For instance, the Environmental Directive has one article dedicated to the need of environmental impact studies, and it has not been highlighted because Europe is afraid that the member states are going to stop it on its tracks. So from the year 2004, from the start of the crisis, the economic crisis, and from the beginning of the identity crisis and the power and the struggle of power and the states, the fact that there is not a civilization in Europe has debilitated the European Union. So now we need to strengthen the concept of European identity to face the different member states, which does not mean that European identity is not and I'm outraged by that too, and I criticize that, is a conflict among nations and Europe. I believe that we cannot build the identity of Europe from this concept of nations. There are many political interests. The conflict of member states and Europe because of sovereignty is currently happening, and it can happen in the future. And we cannot identify Europe with a history of institutions. At the European Parliament, we receive every year over 5,000 visits from a group of visitors, and we explain them how institutions work. But if I go to see the Coca-Cola house, I want to know how it is done. I do not want to know how decisions are made. We need to know institutions, but that is not Europe, and we have come to believe that what we do in institutions in Parliament, that is Europe. When we talk about Europe, we talk about the founding fathers, which were very good, but that happened after the Second World War. But Europe has been there for 3,000 years. That's my theory, and that's why it was so easy to create it, because Europe has been making that exercise for 3,000 years. So I want to talk about the essential axes to identify Europe. I'm not going to discuss all of them. That would be impossible. I'm going back to my first image. What are my sources? I am not based on any theory. I am rather I'm based on something that I studied and that was important at the time, which is all the School of Vienna. That school of thought was very important for where Margaret Smither in anthropology was there. Many historians of art were included there. All of that, at the time, is the concept of civilization. That's when they defined that concept. Many books were written, The Myth of State, in 1946. They were mostly Jews, and they reflected something that is still valid nowadays, and is Europe as being great, even before the two world wars. Civilization has to be prevailing, but we need to have a vision from the culture, and that vision is what is a civilization. I'll talk about that later on, but first I'd like to discuss the notion of identity. The first question we need to ask ourselves with regard to European identity is, who am I? That's the first identity problem. Who am I? I'm not going to know who I am because there is a Brexit or states fight each other, maybe, but I'm not going to ask who I am for small things. This is a deep question that human beings have always had. So the identity of Europe belongs to the world of psychology and feelings and emotions. I'd like to defend that the idea of civilization belongs to a complex system. Identity is not simple. Civilization is not simple. It's contradictory. It's full of yes and no's, black and whites. Civilization and identity is full of dichotomies. I can see it from my point of view, or I can do something different. I like what a professor in Algeria said. Identity is an individual psychological problem. It needs a psychological and we need to ask ourselves, looking towards the past, and see where we come from. What did others think about this? What have I inherited? And in the search of the past, I find myself. So I believe that in schools we need to teach European identity through daily experience. For instance, all the environmental directives come from the Middle Ages. All in all, is the same. It's just one other way of thinking on the environment. That is Europe. We need to find it within ourselves. And from the good and bad, we need to choose, and we need to teach individuals to see around them and gather some values from the past. It's a mix of rational and feeling, and we need to practice being European. Who's the best European citizen? The one who practices the actions that Europe wants us to make. For instance, we need to recycle, to separate rubbish, to recognize this rights of citizens, maybe. Being against death penalty, that's also a European topic, but in our daily and our daily routine, we are always being Europeans. And we need to have a personal discovery. It has to be personal and also scientific. And that's why experiences and memories are very important. In the UK, they do discovery by learning. Learning by discovery. So we need to experience things. And it's not just enough teaching art and going to the museums. We need to teach them the responsibility of preserving them. What is the European civilization? European civilization, as all civilizations, is a complex and flexible system in a territory that is not limited and with variable borders. It depends on many factors, but at present one country can be very far from Europe, but start belonging to Europe because borders are never static. Sometimes we discuss what is the end of Europe. I have never agreed with Germany, with the idea that Kosovo would belong to Europe, maybe in the future, but Germany has always wanted Kosovo to be inside. So the debate is, where is the border? That has been, for instance, the case with Turkey, has been discussed over and over again until 3 in the morning in the parliament, talking about what happened to Turkey. But there is something even more important, which is that one civilization, and Europe, is like a Darwinian stream. There is nothing that is static. It's an evolution that is still alive. Even nowadays, we need to keep on building on civilization. And as a river, it takes from one place and the other, and it goes on, and one thing stays and the other one goes. And that's why it's so difficult. It's immaterial, and that's why it's not really of scientific nature to grasp the concept of European civilization, because it's a feeling, it's a way of understanding the world with many regional particularities. But that is the foundation that we have been building for so long. And there is one clear idea recognized by many, which is what would be European civilization is space for liberty and freedom. That's one chapter by Brodel. He wrote about it, and that's the history of civilizations. And it's the space of freedom and liberty. One of the main topics I would like to discuss is precisely that. What is a European space of freedom? The European civilization is not just about Europe, but also continents that stem from Europe, for instance, Latin America, Australia, Canada, the US. It includes different artistic manifestations, but with a common ground. For instance, the King Alphonse X, the codes, they are nowadays also an influence of the United States in Louisiana. Even the Count of Florida Blanca has an important role when he talked about the independence of America. The fight for freedom of Indians, that comes from an idea of Spain. The struggle against slaves it comes from Europe too. So those countries in Latin America, North America, in Australia, they all stem from Europe. Everything comes from Europe. All variables have evolved in the past and in the future, and I think it's important that influx. Europe is like a river, but it's asymmetrical as all complex systems. Culture, history, they're all asymmetrical. What does that mean? And intensity varies, is a variable. Before we talked about Europe as variables that constitute the pillar of like an archaeologist study. So you see one variable, you can see one of the topics could be human rights. Sometimes in history, those variables are up and down, more or less important. And they have different intensity depending on the country and depending on the history. Maybe nowadays we have a concept that is in crisis, or maybe reality is bigger than legislation at one point in history that should not worry us. In Spain or in Greece, we have, well, in Europe we have a common higher education space that I help draft, but that document, even though there is one document, in Greece and in Spain we do not recognize sometimes the European titles. Even though these degrees, this common diploma exist in Europe, sometimes they're not recognized in Spain or in Greece, but that can change in the future. So it's not always the same in Europe. There is a Nazi crisis that broke Europe, but now, or the fall of the Berlin Wall, it broke Europe too. But there is a regeneration movement constantly in history, so we could not see that from just that point of view. It's always in movement. All social sciences discuss this. It's important to know that there is not just one point in history and one origin in Europe. We cannot have a simplistic view and to see everything as crystal clear. The origin of Europe is not easy to determine. I think that in the past, the Hammurabi Codex talks about Europe, but in half an hour we could not discuss what happened with Syrian or the Hammurabi Codex and the basis for Rome and Athens, but we have references in the past. So Brodel says that if Christ did not exist as history describes him, it could have been somebody else, and it could have been the same with Islam. A civilization is greater than history itself. There are many civilizations. We need to take something into account. Steiner, and for me Steiner's book is a staple book, even though he didn't write a second part of the book, he didn't want to write even more, but he talked about Greece before Socrates. Even the same way that Europe is not crystal clear in its borders, it has had different points of lack of stability, and that is part of the identity of Europe, as it happens with many different interests and with many people living in Europe. There are some values that are a consequence of the struggle for the European identity. We have managed to build the European identity building on fights and on struggles and wars. Sometimes we are very afraid of conflict, we are afraid of facing reality, and we do not realize that Europe was precisely born from these struggles and fights, and those gave us the rights that we have now. We had to conquer our rights, and rights have been conquered in history, and we need to have that feeling. We need to have that spirit of conquest in order to keep on building Europe. Many politicians are afraid of dealing with these topics. How can they say that? They're paid to deal with complicated issues. Academics as well, they are afraid of dealing with these topics because sometimes they're not going to have a round article. Sometimes we are afraid of dealing with the origin of Europe. We do not have a children's right in Europe, and that is something to be ashamed of. We have written about human rights, but we have not done the same with children's rights. It's complicated because on the right side we want to talk, on the right wing wants to talk about family, the left wants to talk about women, and we do not agree. And that is a problem with struggling with the continuity of Europe. Conflict and struggle is something of Europe, and we can see that even nowadays. Europe many times legislates from disasters, like natural disasters, for instance. We only face problems when there are disasters happening, and that's one of our limitations. What are the essential European values? Europe is a space of freedom and recognition of freedom and dignity of people. And I repeat once again, freedom and liberty. There are many axes that we could discuss, but I'm going to focus on two. The freedom and the recognition of dignity of people, and Europe as rule of law, as an institutional structure. I'm going to talk about the man as the measure of all things. That is an idea before Socrates. Freedom and of conscience and dignity of man. Here you can see the first martyr of Europe, like Thomas More, and the revelry of political of religious martyrs. They were individuals who opposed and took a step forward for their ideas, and they knew that it was going to cost their lives, but they defended some European principles like freedom of conscience and dignity of men, and something is very European. There is a book by Richard Turner, The Passion of Western Civilization, or something like that. It says that in Europe everything is seen by archetypes. And when we talk about values of the Western world, we highlight the value of exemplarity. Even in a book written in 1946, we recognize that in Europe it's very important the history of heroes, the personification of heroes. We are going back to the person, to the human being. That is Europe too. Recognizing merits. Pericles' speech and his ideas were very interesting because Obama, I think during his last mandate, he used Pericles as part of his speech, where he recognized merit and the need of equality, even though he knows that there was slavery that was not considered unfair. But he said, we are all the same, we are all equal. Europe, in its history, is truffled with a glorious moment where the dignity of man was defended. For instance, the Charter of Florence in the 15th century said that all Europeans who love freedom and liberty have to come and live in Florence. All those who want to have a dignity, they have to come to Florence. That was a defense of freedom, but always centered in the human being. But there is something very interesting, which is after being free, men value innovation and originality. When man is free to think, research comes into play. I'll deal with that later. Pre-Socratics were very important, and they should be in as an altar piece for Europe, because they start thinking, what is the world composed of? And nobody dared saying that before, because religions had been those answering the questions, but those people thought and researched what was the world about, and they went far from the religion point of view, and they start researching about fire, water, etc. Research is not dealt with in dictatorships, for instance. It happens in original Islam. Research was killed by Islam many times, because in research you never know what is the last step that you take, and so you're taking risk, and those risks can only be taken from freedom. And so I believe that research and innovation are very important, and they're important for knowledge. I'll come back to that later. But having the person as the center access for Europe, and studying Europe through art, has portrait as the main characteristic. Nobody before was interested in portrait, because they focus on people. I am talking about realistic portraits with wrinkles, for instance. The mother of Dürer, Albert Dürer. Europe is portrait because we're trying to find people and commemorating people and celebrating people. They want to be the heroes of the future, and that is fundamental to perpetuate. Even saints are portraits as well. Saints are not for being devotional, but they're rather heroes, models, and that is something very interesting. What are the roots and the focuses of influence in Europe? What are the bases? There are two different ideas, Greek and Roman culture and Christianism. We cannot be as limited as thinking that Christianity is about religion. We need to discuss and study Christianity from its cultural point of view, not just religion. From the Greek culture, the man is the center of all things, where we see Trajan was very important, his ideas, everybody having access to culture. Centuries later, it was these ideas were taken back from Greece. And then we have Christianity. I believe that Christianity is very important, and without Christianity we could not understand Europe, whether we like it or not. And I believe that what Sarkozy said at the European Constitution, he said something stupid because he did want to include it as a religion only. But Christianity, Sarkozy, he wanted to eliminate religion and to have that republican spirit of Europe. But he has to understand that everything was written right before republican ideas. Christianity as culture needs to be analyzed. Why is it important? If we analyze books as Beverly and many other books, they talk about the concept of equality in Christianity. Christianity discussed equality, but Another important thing that I have never seen written is that when Christianity says the man is made the image of God, that's something very strong because it never equated men to God. That's a very novel idea. It was made at the image and similar to God.
A member of parliament from France, I suppose she's going to be postulating herself against Macron and the present president. The man, when under Christianity, stood up. He looks in the eyes of God. And from there is an important arrogance and the legitimacy to rebel against God. The Sermon of the Mountain is interesting, but there are other elements in Christianity as well. An essential work of art is the Last Supper. When would God sit with his colleagues to eat and all of them talking together and touching one with each other? This is a real revolution. Today we're looking at it from the from an idea where God is not that important, as those who were looking at this picture at the time when they considered that he was really God. And this has revolutionary consequences. For instance, man comes into stage. For art historians, all temples, the normal believers could not enter the temple. In the case of Olympia, for instance, was deserted and there was no water, and there was drought because a woman really entered the temple, and that brought with it the desert, and because she desecrated the temple. So there was a territory where the divine was, and the normal beings couldn't enter there. But with Christianity, yes. I mean, with the big basilica, they could enter, and they coexist with the sacred. And this is the legitimation of the person. This is a recognition of something which is very important. Here is another one. This mass of people can be normal today, but in those days were not. This was not normal in the original Christianity. And this is a very important fact. It is the recognition of a religious nature that facilitates democracy as a mass of people that can be present and can vote. I want to go back to research, creativity, and evolution. Something which is very important for art historians is originality. There's an article by Ackerman on Renaissance, which I quote very often, where he speaks about originality. For Europe, the merit of an artist is to be innovative, and that he can establish a school. But imitation is really condemned. This condemns to manifestations of contemporary art which are not art. We call some of these things that are simple cultural events, but not necessarily art. They revolve around art, but not necessarily art, because originality is basic. Otherwise, it's provincial art. The serious danger of regional history is, as Ackerman says, you do geography of art, but not history of art. You touch an artist because he lived there. And this is the danger of the mentality of the parish and not the cosmopolitan view. clear issue in Europe is the evolution and concept of progress. I've spoken a lot with Gianni Vattimo regarding this, and the concept of progress is being quite damaging, and it's probably an inheritance from Christianity. Everything improves, but that doesn't happen. I don't want to enter in this really controversy, but the concept of progress towards infinite is why? Why should always be progress? Progress is something that may perhaps entail to recover the past, not necessarily the future. The right to rebelliousness and the liberty of thought, or the freedom of thought. The problem between doubt and confusion, European attitudes. That who innovates and that who takes risks is the one that doubts. And Europe always is doubting. Anything that you put on the table of the European legislator, they will say, yes, but no, because I'm not going to really be bold enough. The rights of the child, no, not yet. Or why do not really denounce Muslim women that are forced to get married? Well, it's complicated. So, and then the doubt, the permanent doubt. These are breaks that stop us. With Pokemon Go, I'm a passionate fan of that. With Pokemon Go, there is a figure of Pokemon that only exists in Europe. Well, that figure, Mr. Vine, what are its abilities? Confusion. It generates confusion. That's the image that we project on the Japanese, which is tremendous. We have been identified with generating confusion. Now I want to talk of another topic that has derives some person, individuality. In that complex process of an asymmetrical nature, sometimes the recognition of the rights of the person, we fall into individualism. An interesting book of a publishing house on European identity. The director of the edition is Pagde. There is a mention of the excessive individualism in Europe, and this is important. But I want to underscore the value of a human life, and the individual is one of the core bases. The right of the individual and the respect to the individual. For me, a review of the literature of the Holocaust and the literature of those who lived in the emergence of Nazism, like Klempler. There is a phenomenon as a disease that invaded, but they didn't see the individual; they saw the mass. And when Primo Levi narrates his stay in Auschwitz, or I can't remember whether he was in Auschwitz or in another concentration camp, when he was talking to the ones who were in the lab, something that saved his life because he was a chemist, they looked at him as if he was an object. They needed that person, and in the executioner mind, they were looking at that person as a part of the mass. Stalin says, a death is a tragedy, 2 million dead is statistics. And this is like that. If we want to keep the spirit of Europe, we have to keep the value of the individual and the person, but not to make a selfish person out of every individual, which is the danger of nationalism and bigotry. The search for balance is something very important, taking into account the pressures we have. Selfish Europe, they're talking of that. Some articles in the States, in the United States. But there's something important because it is intimate. The inhibition, both institutional and personal. A great book or a great author is Maria Zambrano. She has chapters that we should incorporate because Maria Zambrano has been scarcely quoted because she was leftist but Christian, and she has been forgotten because of that. Maria Zambrano speaks in Unamuno and in other works of inhibition, of really not assuming responsibility. And the problem in a well-developed society like ours, we don't look at the other sometimes, and that is an evil. It's sometimes better off for solidarity with other people. And this is happening, or we are seeing it with the Syrian refugees. Which were the instruments developed by Europe to guarantee freedom? I think it is important that in Europe, as a tool, let us not confuse tools with goals. Education is a tool. I dislike to see the confusion between goals and tools. Education is basic for Europe. It is in the Greek world, in Roman, where they hire Greeks to teach, not only men but also women in the Roman world, and the church that replaces the Roman Empire. In order to understand the function of Christianity, one should understand the church as an institution. Renaissance and humanism. Heidegger, for instance, considers that Renaissance humanism is education. And a proof of this is how in the Renaissance there are a lot of treatises written. There are treatises in the Middle Ages when Europe is started to being configured. For example, treatises about women and education of women in the 13th and 14th century. Alphonse the 10th, Eximenes in Catalonia, they deal with education. Their books were with the instructions to facilitate knowledge. Education is part and parcel of the use of freedom. And that mixture is that you have to be capable of managing yourself, your ego. And the other instrument is the legislative corpora and the development of a system of rights and relations. There is a legal structure generated in Europe, which is the basis of Europe. So it is so easy to legislate now because everything is already done. I mean, you have to amend here and there. You can see the code of the partidas by Alphonse the Wise, and there is everything. So the creation of institutions and structures of municipal and state governments are fundamental points. I have developed the part of man. Now I'm going to turn to law. For Brodel and for other authors like Cassirer as well, or for Fukuyama too, law and state go hand in hand. But that is after the 12th century. Before, there was a weak Europe, no state structures. They were living from common law. But what is important is from the 13th century, there is a huge movement of a European nature in many countries in Europe to create a legislative corpus to collect common law. There is an essential point which I have studied a lot. After the First World War and until the 70s was quite trendy, not any longer. The French lawyer or jurists in the Max Planck Institute, for instance, European law was taught in the same universities from the 9th and 10th century until the French Revolution. It is not peccata minuta that we were with the same legislation in Europe, and this is is a wealth that is not looked at right now. People look at states and nations rather than to the overall scale. To respect individual rights, you have to create a state. a body where the state is also under the law. Common law and Roman law and canonic law fix the right of the individual, but also the role of the state and the right of the individual versus the state. Contractual relations, even in feudalism, had contractual contracts with a weak link for the obviously for the servants. Constitutionalism is born from the concept of pact, of agreement between the government and the governed. 13th century is the great century of the legal revolution. There's where Europe is born, where Europe is structured. Countries that didn't go through this revolution of the 13th century, well, are having trouble with this. For instance, Greece. Middle Ages is a mixture of common, canonical, and Roman law. Frederick II of Sicily, the great legislator, who builds an administration of public nature and a public university, the one by Frederick II. He should be one of the great patrons, more than Schumann and others. He's the real originator of Europe. Frederick II is spectacular. His conflicts against the Pope were because he wanted to develop a public system. What is extraordinary is that Vladimir II of Denmark, from 1241, he enacts a code, and the bishop that drafts it had been in Oxford, in Paris, and Bologna. So there's a spectacular phenomenon of law where the new jurists travel, and Alphonse the 10th in those days, well, popes lived shorter than now, but anyway, the same jurists work together. In Murcia, Rodrigo Gil de Juntero, excuse me, it was Jacobo de las Leyes, Jacob of the Laws, was a jurist who worked with Frederick II. Frederick dies and he comes to Spain, and he cooperates with Alphonse the Wise in the Code of the Partidas. So there is a permanent relation between universities. But how can we spark the Ius Gentium without understanding Salamanca University in the 16th, 17th centuries? So this is very important. Universities, Bologna, Paris, Oxford, Salamanca, and others. Some were specialized in medicine, like Montpellier and others. But the great beacons are these. And I'm thinking of finishing. What evolves from here? An important phenomenon. We have seen the people that goes into the church, people that acquires rights, the creation of systems, contractual systems between state and citizens, more or less democratic systems, the basis of what constitutionalism will become. And democratic system is quite characteristic of Europe. We have the British Parliament here. The least in this asymmetrical development is that some achieve this earlier than others. There's no synchronicity. There's evolutionary. Democracy takes longer to come in certain countries than in others. But if we analyze the legislation of the bylaws and charters in Spain, we can see democracy there, or the pacts and the oath of the king in front of the parliament. It is a way of starting with democracy. So the recognition of the individual and also the collective law versus state. We have dictatorships, of course, but dictatorships fell. The same as the Berlin Wall fell on its own. It had to fall. So these policies by Orban and others is only something that won't last long. They're going to fall very soon. That is why there is this fear to non-democracy. My final reflection: instability starts from inside the system. Instability starts from inside the system. So we have to check our own diseases: inhibition, individualism, nationalisms. These are weaknesses inside the system. When sociologically we are used to see the enemy from outside, it is ourselves. So we have a responsibility. And I think narrative should be built in Europe, promoted by the education world. We should stop bothering our students whether there is a European Council or whatever. Let us say that our grandparents were already Europeans, and the laws that affect you are European as well, and to develop laws with the concept of responsibility. For instance, in the issue of heritage, I have to lecture the day after tomorrow on a research project where I sustain that we shouldn't take them only to museums. There are other battles in the day-to-day things. Try and see, a bit like the Pokemon, try and see whether the ivy that grows in the walls of the churches is part of the history. We have to take care of that as well. And when we put a blackboard with the policies in environment, let us show that this is European, and that if you really damage the environment, is something that is already regulated in Europe. It is important now, in the face of crises like the Brexit, to sustain or to establish sustainability in the institutions. We thought perhaps that they were eternal, and we cannot destroy the institutions for the generations to come. The principle of precaution on the environment. This is pure European legislation. When there is the risk to destroy something, you cannot build that in one generation. If you want to destroy a relic of a forest, you cannot destroy that, even if a mayor wishes to do that. You cannot really destroy the environment. The states, the European Union, the institutions, hundreds of years have elapsed to build that. Why should a politician that put to the vote of a referendum to destroy something that has taken centuries to build? That kind of decisions are really a punishment to the people rather than other things. And this is a lesson we should learn from the pacts and the contract of law between individual and the state, but also politicians with the state. A politician shouldn't be so powerful as to change things, be it in Britain, in Hungary, in Spain, or anywhere else. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Thank you, Cristina, for your analysis of the keys on what is Europe and European civilization. We have seen whole history, and her professional and personal trajectory has borne its fruits. We're still digesting, so to speak, all of the thoughts that she gave us. Any question? Thank you. But I have the feeling that after listening to you that we live in a radically different, and I mean radically from the roots, not radical. I am surprised by some things. When you talked about European identity, there was a question of who I am. Don't you think that rather we would have to ask who and what are the others and how we have alienated them? And for instance, those like Latin America, Africa, or Southern Europe, or precarious citizens. And the second question is, when you identify Europe with freedom and liberty, the only way that I can approach this identification is freedom for whom, by whom, and what are the consequences of this freedom. If the answer is man, not woman, of white race, heterosexual, of a good socioeconomic background, then maybe yes, but otherwise I would not understand your answer. First of all, in order to understand this idea, perception is just an objective that you need to take off your head, and sometimes it's not achieved. I'm talking about a process. Europe has moved towards freedom, and from slavery in Rome or in Europe or in the 16th century, the situation is better now than then. It is a process, and sometimes there are setbacks, and you can see that. But answering to your question, if you do not have your principles clear, you cannot identify the victim who is lacking those rights. If you don't know what are the rights of human beings, you cannot identify what is happening with others. And we see that in our daily life, our family life, but also when we are exploiting societies. Because as a historian, you need to be in the shoes of the governing bodies at the time, because you cannot apply concepts of the present in the past. In her testament, Isabel, the Catholic queen, she wrote about who she lives, who inherited what. But mostly she talked about the end of slavery in Latin America, but that took a while. And from Isabel, the Catholic queen, we created the School of Salamanca that defending the rights of the people, and it took hundreds of years to assimilate. But in the 16th century, I've seen many testaments that say the following. They deal with war slaves, but they're freed in the testament because they know that it's not right to have slaves. And then in the 17th century, there are not many slaves left. Out of 3,000 people, maybe there were 15 slaves. So it's a process where you have to be in the shoes of some others. What Isabel did at the time was a revolution, because a slave existed at the time, and law has to evolve to be adopted by states. And as I said, that is a process that goes on building on each other. And we need to understand what is a process. We cannot say that the world is static. That's why university students and historians need to understand what happened in the past and criticize what happened, but you cannot send them to the prison of history, because at the time maybe their ideas were revolutionary. Why does why does ETA kill here in Spain? Because they have the concept of history, and they build their own history that allows them to kill in certain circumstances. But it is important that in history and in our setting, they tell, the society tells them that that is not right, and that's why victims are important. And in Colombia now, they want peace, but society do not want them, because do not want peace with FARC, for instance, because they are remembering their own people who died, their own victims. So society cannot be static. How many universities have denounced the case of girls from Morocco who were married in their countries of origin? We need to be responsible in society. And that's important nowadays. With regard to your other question, sometimes things move faster than we think. I am very old now, but I have lived the process of integration of homosexuality in Spain, and it has been done in 30 years. Maybe you think that it's long, but for 2,000 and more years, the homosexuals have been condemned by society. Should have been faster, probably yes, but it is currently happening. You cannot think back, thinking on what happened in the past. We need to make sure that we do not repeat mistakes of history. Your presentation was very interesting. I wanted to ask you the following. You mentioned as an element of change of civilization the example of the Darwinian evolution paradigm. I believe that that can be very dangerous because it was done by a British citizen at the times of colonies. And we are still suffering the consequences of that from a perspective that sometimes we are the worst judges of ourselves. And the identity that other cultures have of Europe comes sometimes by the time of colonies, not that far away from us. We are discussing the hegemony of the less favored in society, and we're trying to seeing that struggle is inevitable if we want to progress. I'm going to answer this so I do not forget. I don't know if you read the book by Gadamer, Truth and Method by Gadamer, a German philosopher, and he explains how the vision of each person depends on their experience. Your idea of Darwinism is very different to mine, because Darwinian, for me, and the image of Darwin is the permanent evolution from a genetic point of view. So society is evolving, and if you deny evolution and you stop, it does not work. You need to assume some risk, because if birds do not fly, if they deny flying, then they cannot fly any longer. So you need to be constantly evolving. So if Europe stopped, it would die. So that's why when I'm talking about civilization, they're like a Darwinian stream. I'm not talking about the history of Darwin himself as a human being. Then you mentioned a last question. What was the last sentence that you mentioned? Sorry, I can't remember. Maybe you can ask again later during lunch. Good morning, Ms. Cristina Gutiérrez. I'd like to ask you the following question. You have worked at the European Parliament, so I wanted to know, those who built the European project, I think, they thought that integration had to be from an economic, cultural, and social point of view on different aspects. And it has been mostly done from an economic point of view, as it usually happens. And social integration and cultural integration, it should be fostered. do you think that because of the economic struggle in Europe now, Europe is going to thrive or keep on thriving? And do you think that we will achieve to be similar to what those who thought of Europe actually thought of it?
Yes. I would like to thank you, first of all, for such an ample overview of where we come from. But of course, I'm interested also in where we're going. And 30 years ago, already with my lamented friend and director, Professor José Vidal-Benito, who many of you probably know or have known, we were talking of a Europe which would be meta-governmental, not intergovernmental. And the founding fathers thought of a Europe which would be a Europe of the people. I've asked our dear guests here to distribute the Manifesto Ventotene because I think that still there are many ideas which we should be considering today because they have not been realized. Now the real question is, it seems to me that power in the European Union has been kidnapped by the Council. We are in a Europe of the governments, not in a Europe of the people. And when will the European Parliament take back, and how will it take back, the central role which it should have in the European edifice?
¿Alguna más? Ninguna más. Vale. Yo creo que aquí hay una cosa, vamos a ver.
There is one thing here. Someone from Seville before was asking. There is an important issue here. Europe has conquered little by little spaces of power because it was in its own construction. So the concept, well, it started with the economy, and it hasn't entered culture. They don't dare because countries think that culture is something of their area only. Of course, Erasmus has been created, but there's nothing binding in the area of culture, which is one of the failures. When I heard Angela Merkel saying that one of the problems in Spain, there was a problem of vocational education, was a failure, but it was a tremendous thing. I mean, to dare talking of some other country, not of their own country. There are quite abstract and general programs, but saying we have to pull this around. Well, heritage is in. Or the label of heritage is not really put into practice. They don't dare. And it is in a way forbidden. It is a no-go area. And the element of identity, they have given Germany the presidency when Germany is one of the countries that has most difficult or the highest or the biggest difficulties to really build their history. And then we have in the East the pressure by Stalin. So there are things here which make difficult to have a strategy in culture. And what you said, Professor, on the meta-government, the aspiration of Europe was to build a united state. But if we wish to, that was planned in Maastricht, but then they would say that the European Parliament had more legitimacy than the national parliaments. But since 2004, intergovernmental policy was criticized. First because Barroso didn't dare, and then because when states were very strong and they have united among themselves. The bloc of the East have a unique vote, and they have minorities of blockage. This is a personal story. I was talking about the directive of soil, to try to avoid the buildings in beaches and so on. No one wanted to accept the directive, not Germany, not France, etc. But the parliament voted it. It was approved by the council, but the parliament voted it. And I achieved something that the directives were binding in objectives, but not in methodology. If Europe wanted to have a meta-government, they should not legislate on the day-to-day things. I don't care whether nitrate is 2 or 3 points up or down. Chemicals are really it's incredible. I mean, we're entering in a small shop in a little village. One has to legislate in the big things. Enough is enough with small things. For me, the present model, a constitution that had 400 pages, is an absolute ridiculous. It should have 60 at the most. The other day, and I'm going to give you an example, I asked a president of a court, how should we do to reform justice? And he said, we should empty things that we hear of in tribunals and deal them away. Well, this happens again in Europe. There is on modified or genetically modified organisms, or whether nurses can prescribe prescriptions, etc. These are small things, and these reforms should be made. Then the element of conflicts. Now I come to the question you made. There's nothing you can gain in life without conflict. It cannot be serendipitously achieved. Even what society does is to show a need, and the human being is more limited, or politicians are more limited than we may think. Legislate on things that are not necessary is when tragedy appears. It's sad to be said like that, but it is like this. Rights sometimes are given because you have to remove something that other has. Conflict is what ends feudalisms, or through suffering, which is another way of having conflict. The oppression of Muslim girls in Europe is a conflict, is suffering, even if I don't suffer it. So this should be legislated. But the concept of conflict and the need is quite variable, and there has to be someone to include it.
Sí.
Buenas tardes. Yeah.
Good afternoon. A question, your reflections remind me of the reflection of Habermas on the reflection of European nationality and European identity. But this also means to substitute nationality and the European narrative versus the polyphony of national narratives. How can the European Union act when there is no exclusive competence on this issue, because the European Union has not a competence on education or culture? There is a problem we have, which is the yearn for legislation. Nothing can be done if it's not legislated. Common law and social practice should teach us that social practice goes beyond legislation. When legislation comes, the project is finished. We shouldn't legislate that much. Society should function itself. Erasmus is something that is beyond legislation. At first, the diplomas were not accredited. Why should I give a good marks if it is in Denmark where they have got social practice, market, etc. is generating a single market, and not everything has to be legislated upon. And European identity doesn't need documents. Europe has embassies in all over the world, and a European that goes to another country can be helped in an embassy, not of his country, but from other European country. When I speak of law, I speak as a citizen. I may not use the appropriate words. I'm not an expert in law. But there is something I say which is important. There is a possibility that in a claim, if Europe has a legislation that is more beneficial to you, the German or the Spaniard can go to the European legislation. Which cases have been applied in this matter in Spain? Very few. We can use the common rights offered by Europe, and we are not using them. We are demanding a lot of paperwork, but we should deepen in Europe in activities and practices that are a single market and a free movement of people. Is it more European? It is more European to be recognized by a professor or to a professor to have taught abroad with no legislation. They should recognize that, of a person that has been working in a Max Planck Institute or in a Belgian university and is not being recognized now. I'm talking of diplomas because this is something you understand very well.